Well, with the arrival of fall and its gorgeous colors and seasonal lattes, PSL anyone? Yeah, us neither. Comes a brand new update on what's going on in Alberta's economy. Hey there, you're listening to The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host, Scott Crockett, and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. Well, today I am flying solo as my co-host is away, but I am thrilled to be joined by BCA's chief economist, Mike Holden, to break down some of his insights on Alberta's economy. We'll talk about the good, such as more Canadians moving to the province. Challenging, Albertans are still facing major price pressures with inflation and low wage growth, and what we can expect for Alberta's economy over the next quarter, such as what predictions for national recessions mean for the province. But before we get to our conversation, a quick request. If you like this show, please consider giving Alberta Better a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, submitting a review, and subscribing to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. It all helps us make the best show possible. Thank you. Now, on to the show. Okay, well, we're back with our quarterly episode on Alberta's economy. And at the time of this recording, the Flames and the Oilers have won both of their games. So congratulations to us and also to you, Mike.
Yay, Oilers.
Investment in Alberta is booming and it's diversifying. And just a few days ago, Alberta swore in its 19th premier. So just to kind of start, give us the headline of what's been going on in Alberta's economy over the past quarter.
Oh, thanks, Britt. There are a lot of things that are going on. I think that in general, what we're seeing is an economic slowdown it's hitting the entire world. It's hitting all of Canada and Alberta, and we're facing high inflation, some geopolitical tensions, high commodity prices, soaring costs for consumers, and so these things are all taking the wind out of the sails of the provincial economy. But at the same time, a lot of those same things are on the commodity price side. They're helping the economy out in Alberta, and so we're kind of getting headwinds and tailwinds at the same time. And on the whole, what that means is that the province is doing better than other provinces are, but it's not immune to the kinds of effects that we're seeing.
Yeah, it's a weird place for Albertans to be in. Like, things are going really well on kind of the macroeconomic side of things, but Albertans are still feeling insane amount of pressure on prices and inflation and things like that are kind of caused by our high economic activity. So it's an interesting place, and we'll get into all of that. So let's start with the labor market. Employment is slowing down in Canada, and unemployment has actually gone up a little bit in Canada. So talk to us about what's happening in the labor market and what's contributing to this slight uptick in unemployment.
Yeah, you're right. So labor markets are also in an odd place in Canada since COVID. And so what we've seen, we would expect to have seen this large post-pandemic rebound in job growth. And we did. We saw that happen in Canada and in Alberta specifically. And the unemployment rate dropped rapidly and significantly over that period. And so the employment rate was around 4.8% nationally and provincially. And yeah, what's happened is since the last quarter, so since about June, the economy's really stopped adding jobs, especially nationally. It's a bit better in Alberta. We're still seeing some gains. And so in September, that's the most recent jobs numbers that came out, there was a slight increase nationally and an increase provincially. But over the last quarter, like over the summer, there was actually a decrease in the number of jobs nationwide. And so we've got actually about as many jobs now in Canada as we had in March. So it's like the Canadian economy stopped adding jobs and people kind of didn't notice. And like I said, here in Alberta, we are still gaining, but it's decelerating. So we're seeing slower job growth.
Has that impacted labor shortages at all?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. It hasn't, is the short answer
so
to that.
So we still have no skilled people for the jobs that we do have available.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of a delay in the data that you have. So we can have employment numbers for September, but job shortage numbers only for like July. And
right.
So there's a bit of a delay in the one compared to the other, but it's coming down a little bit, but there's still just under like 1 million unfilled jobs nationally, and that's a huge number. It's like it's triple what it was pre-COVID. And provincially, it's the same sort of thing. I mean, it's about 1/10, so we're just over 100,000 unfilled jobs here. So Yeah, so at the same time, employment growth is slowing. As you said, the unemployment rate is increasing. I can talk about that a bit too. But there's still like the 100,000 vacant jobs sitting out there. So
Right.
it's an odd labor market.
So at what point does labor shortages become an endemic problem? If the issue is we don't have the skills in our workforce for the jobs we have available, how long is it going to take for us to scale up the workforce and get them in those jobs to bring those available jobs down and to alleviate some of this labor shortage?
Well, there are a couple of things going on there. So that's one of them is the skill shortage issue. And so when we do all the work that we've done on long-term unemployment focuses on that particular problem. So you still have a number of people who are unemployed who haven't been able to find work. I think there's about 16,000 Albertans right now who still have been unemployed for a year or more and unable to find a job. But that's 16,000 is a small share of
Right.
the 100,000 job vacancies that are out there. And so there is a need to do that for sure. And there are skills gaps that employers are telling us that they see in their workforce or that they see in the job applicants that they're getting. But the other challenge, and your question about when it becomes endemic, I think it is and will continue to be for quite a while. And part of the reason for that is we're seeing labor force participation is dropping. That's why, we talked about earlier about the unemployment rate going back up again. And it's not in Alberta, it's gone back up too. In fact, it's gone up more than it has nationally. And it's not because we're not still adding jobs, because we are. But what's happening is we have, in Alberta, there are more people looking for work. But that's been like a 2-month bump, and the longer-term trend has been a decline in labor force participation. That's just because the population's getting older. So we have
Right.
more people in that sort of 55-plus age range. And
More
so,
retirements.
yeah, more retirements, more people being disengaged from the workforce. And, some people will say that there's some age-based discrimination in terms of hiring. And I think that all of those things are probably contributing to this. And so that's a harder challenge to overcome. And
Right.
so federally, we're seeing the government is trying to increase the number of immigrants that we bring into Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's about the only step that we can take to help alleviate this thing. It's sort of age cohort issue and
Right.
and bring skilled people into the country to fill the jobs that we've got.
So on the, I guess, good news front, though, Canadians are moving to Alberta. And that's really good news because for so long, like, people have been leaving Alberta. But we've been seeing quarter after quarter after quarter, people are coming to the province. What's driving that?
Yeah, it's true. It's been a good news story. And the last 3 or 4 quarters, we've seen a turnaround. And so typically people move from one province to another in search of job opportunities, in search of career opportunities and job progression. And so for about 5-year period, starting in 2014, 2015, there were more Albertans leaving this province and moving to BC and elsewhere than there were people coming in. So we had this net outflow. And prior to that, we had tons of people coming into Alberta. And so that started to turn around again. And I think part of that is because the economic prospects in this province are suddenly looking pretty good.
Right.
We have a more attractive housing market. The cost of living here is lower. And so these numbers sort of predate the provincial government's Alberta is Calling initiative. So even before that happened, we had almost 10,000 people moved into Alberta on a net basis. And that's the best number we've seen in 8 years.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's that there are jobs here. It's an affordable place to live, and people are starting to take notice.
Is it too early to say that the campaign is successful?
Yes, it is. And just from a straight up number standpoint, I mean, the campaign is a good idea, but all the data that we have, the information we have, is from before that campaign started. So, I mean, we already had that momentum. So I'm looking forward to seeing how the campaign could potentially improve on that.
Yeah, me too. So let's talk a little bit more about broader macroeconomic activity. So despite a slowdown in employment, things are going okay still. Like, Alberta is still doing not too bad. Obviously, there are still some challenges. So can you talk about, I guess, the headwinds and the tailwinds that Alberta seems to be caught in the middle of?
Sure, yeah. I mean, and I'll start with the good news. So provincial economy is doing quite well right now. We're, projected growth for 2022 and for next year. Most banks, they expect that Alberta is going to either lead the country or be in second place. So Alberta and Saskatchewan are basically what everybody thinks are the top performing provinces this year and next. And so it's what we're seeing there, in Alberta's case, obviously high energy prices are helping the energy sector.
Right.
It's been a turmoil-filled year for Alberta farmers, who had to plant their crops with record high fertilizer prices, and it was the most expensive crop ever planted.
Yes, it was.
And so it was a high stakes year. And so if it ended up being a poor harvest this year, then they would have been in big trouble. And if it ended up being a good harvest, then, the high commodity prices for agricultural goods, to which they're still quite a bit higher than they have been historically, that would have, helped offset that high fertilizer cost increase. And so we have seen that. I mean, farmers are doing well. It's poised to be an excellent harvest. Hopefully there's enough rail capacity.
I was just going to say, major challenge ahead is rail capacity. We hear that from the ag sector all the time, is like, we just don't have the capacity to get it to market.
Yeah, so agriculture is a positive, the energy sector is a positive, and we're also seeing a lot of new investment coming into the province.
A lot of diversification.
Yeah, a lot of big, high-profile companies. WestJet just reinforced their presence in Calgary.
We love WestJet.
De Havilland is operating the new aviation facility in the province, and 1,500 jobs coming there. A lot of high-profile tech announcements. Net zero petrochemicals. A lot of companies poised to make major investments in carbon capture, and so there's a lot of positives, and so there's this kind of buzz of economic activity happening here. So that's the good news part. The challenges are global and inflation, I guess, the two categories. There's a lot of global turmoil. There's Russia invading Ukraine and some uncertainty what's going on there, European energy markets. Inflation is not just a Canadian problem, so we're seeing countries around the world raising their interest rates. Global economic growth is slowing. The G20 had expected 2.8% growth, and it's downgrading to 2.2% for next year. And so that's a bit of a headwind for Alberta, because we're not immune to those kinds of global pressures. And that's expectations of slower growth, and recession is starting to lower demand for most commodities. Oil is a bit of an exception because OPEC has decided to cut production. But other commodity prices are trending down. So that, plus inflation and relatively stagnant wage growth in Alberta, that's the other negative that's happening.
Right. What is the, rationale behind OPEC cutting production?
Well, I think it's wanting to maintain prices and expectations that global demand is slowing. So we've got, as global economic activity slows, oil demand tends to fall.
Right. No, that makes sense.
Yes. And so it's a way to shore up prices that way.
So talk a little bit about what's happening with wage growth, because that has been sticky situation in Alberta, is that our wages just aren't growing as fast as other places in Canada. And when you put that right next to inflation, man, Albertans are just really struggling with the rising cost of everyday things. So what's happening there?
Yeah, it's a nuanced situation. So inflation, as of the most recent numbers, is running about 7% nationally and about 6% in Alberta. But at the same time, so that means the price of everything is going up. And if the price of everything is going up and your wages are not, then you're worse off. You can't afford to make ends meet. But nationally, we're seeing wages are growing at about 5.4% over the last year. And in Alberta, it's only like 1.6%. And if you go back 2 years, like in 24 months, I think wages are actually lower in Alberta now than they were 24 months ago. So you've got prices.
That's not good news.
No, prices are increasing, but the gap between the price increase and the offsetting wage increase is much wider in Alberta. The silver lining there is that wages in the province are still the highest in the country, but they're not growing, and everybody else is catching up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to come back to talking about this prediction of a recession. But before we get there, let's take a light detour and talk about inflation, because we just talked about it with slow wage growth. So the TLDR version of inflation is still really bad. It's not good. Where are we with inflation? What is the latest data? And then kind of what has been the trajectory since the last update?
Well, it is starting to come down a bit. As of the most recent numbers, we're seeing it peaked about 2 or 3 months ago. And again, there's a couple month lag on the data that comes out. Yeah. So it did peak and was starting to come back down, but it's still way above the Bank of Canada's 1% to 3% band. So we're looking at inflation of around 7%, and might have been as high as 8% at one point. So it's starting to come back down, and part of that's because housing prices are falling. In August, which is the most recent numbers that we've got, oil prices were actually starting to fall at that point. And there was easing price pressures in a range of areas, especially for goods. Services are still pretty tight. Inflation in services is strong. But that may not slow down as much as we hoped it would going forward. Right. So we're seeing commodity prices, like I said, are falling, agricultural prices, metals prices, and so that will help inflation. Inventories are rising, which will also help inflation slow, but oil prices are starting to go back up again. And so that's going to buffer how far back inflation can retreat.
Right. What is your prediction on inflation? Like, when do you think things are going to start to come down to be a little bit more in line with the Bank of Canada's 1% to 3% band?
I mean, it'll take a while. I think it's not going to be a fast process because...
Are we talking like half a decade? Less than 5 years? Or
less than 5 years, I would hope. I mean, what you want to avoid in all of this is a wage price spiral, which is where wages start to go up because people, understandably, if they see the prices of everything...
Wages go up, and then businesses have to raise their prices.
Exactly,
their prices go up, wages go up. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. So you want to avoid that snowball effect.
Right.
But I would say like within a couple of years, I guess. I mean, maybe a year and a half. And it depends on so many things, though, that it's a bit of a dartboard shot guess, So it depends on how fast the global economy slows, depends on geopolitical tensions around the world, depends on the quality of harvest in a number of countries. It depends on China's zero COVID policy and the impact on global supply chains. And so there's a whole bunch of factors that play into this that make it pretty difficult to predict. But the only thing I'd say is that it's not going to drop quickly. It's going to be a gradual decrease.
Yeah. So we're in it for the long haul, I think.
We are.
So let's talk a little bit more about the global economy and I guess the national economy as well. Some economists are predicting a recession.
Yes, they are.
How clear is that prediction? How likely is that to come true? And follow-up question on that. What is the impact on Alberta, given that, we're still doing okay, comparatively speaking?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of economists are talking about a recession coming, and we don't really know for sure. I mean, the more people always think of economists as being super pessimistic people, but they're actually...
I would not have known that.
But yeah, it's weird.
So crazy.
But they're actually not. I think they actually hope for the best, which is why, if you look at economic growth projections...
Predict the worst, hope for the best?
No, they always tend to err to the positive, I think. So people don't want to predict a recession. And so a lot of them are like, well, maybe we'll have a soft landing. Maybe it's not going to be as bad. And so that's kind of the situation that we're in right now. So I think, and I mean, there are some very negative economists out there for sure. The kind that make me look like
I was like, where do you put yourself on the spectrum here, Mike?
I'm somewhere in the middle, I guess. I don't know. Depends on my mood that day. But it's...
Can confirm.
So, but to answer your question, I think there's a strong possibility, and at the very least, we're going to see a substantial deceleration in economic growth. I mean, a recession is technically defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, but there's a difference between what the numbers say and what people feel.
Right.
I mean, so that it's not just because somebody decides that a recession is happening. You can experience that very differently depending on what your personal situation is, or it can be mild, it can be severe, it can be on paper, or it can be very, very real. And so I think that there's a chance for sure. And the second part of your question is how Alberta is doing. So we're in a better position than most to withstand this. And so if you imagine sort of like the little chart going forward and everything's kind of pointing down, it's going to slowly decelerate. Economic growth is not going to be as strong next year as it was this year, and so on. And all those things are true in Alberta as well, but better.
So if the line is, can't quite see on the podcast, but if the line is like here, Alberta's maybe like just above it, it's the same trend.
And the slope going down is probably not as severe. Yeah.
Cool.
So the provincial economies and the national economy, rather, economic growth is going to slow. It'll also slow in Alberta. It won't slow by as much.
Right.
And so we'll end up leading the national average very likely next year as well, even though growth is going to be a lot slower than it is now.
So, Mike, as we come to kind of the close of our conversation here, is there anything else that you came across while you were preparing this report that, you think our listeners would find insightful or interesting?
Well, I mean, I can tell you what I found insightful and interesting, and hopefully it's the same thing the listeners did. So one of the things that we track a lot here and that we sort of worry about, and it's the kind of thing that economists care about, a lot of other people don't, is productivity. So we took a look at the latest productivity numbers, and it's an interesting story across Canada because, I mean, it's commonly known, I think, that Canadian productivity growth has been relatively poor for years and years. And the recent trends have been interesting in that area. So this is something we looked at in this snapshot. And so we saw a huge spike in productivity during COVID, during the initial shutdown stage. And that was largely because most of the sort of low productivity industries were the ones who shut down. And so as soon as you removed the bottom out, then suddenly the total average goes up. But since then, and so there was this spike in productivity, and then it started, as the economy reopened, it started to come back down to normal levels. But the problem is that it kept going down. So productivity now is lower than it was pre-pandemic nationally. And so that's not good news for the Canadian economy. It's not good news for our global competitiveness. And at the same time, rising wage pressures, because they are starting to accelerate a little bit here. That means that the unit labor cost, which is essentially how much labor, the price of labor needed to produce a unit of a good. And that's starting to really go up as well. And so a combination of lower productivity and higher wage costs is a bit of a dangerous combination for businesses. So that's something that was interesting here. And so it's the kind of trend that we need to address going forward in order to make sure that we don't erode our long-term competitiveness and make sure that we maintain our level of prosperity.
What can we do to improve productivity?
I mean, there's basic answer to that, and then there's the reality to it.
I also think we need another full episode on what productivity means, because I think when people hear productivity, it's like, oh, I'm going to be overworked, and that's like a one-way ticket to burnout. And that's not exactly what we mean when we talk about productivity, right? From like an economics perspective.
Yeah, no, in fact, it means the exact opposite of that.
It's like doing more with less.
Yeah, it's doing more with less. As a simple example, I thought of this once. So imagine you're assembling IKEA furniture.
Everybody's favorite task.
Right. And so you've got those little Allen keys, right? And
yes.
So you're sitting there screwing away with your Allen key. But then IKEA recently produced this little it looks like a little baby drill. And you just stick that thing into your Allen key slot, and it just kind of drills it in for you. And
does it come with each piece of furniture, or do you have to get it separately?
I don't remember. I only saw it once, and then I haven't bought IKEA furniture in a while. But this is a thing, and I saw it happen. So that's what productivity is. Yeah. You could build, let's say you could build your IKEA bookshelf in 10 minutes, or actually, no, that's a more realistic number here.
That's very optimistic.
Half an hour.
And I'm still very optimistic.
Yeah, okay, well, but with this little drill thing, you can now do it in 20 minutes.
Right.
You've just become more productive.
Yeah.
And so that's what we need. One of the problems we have in Canada is that we chronically underinvest in machinery, equipment, and new non-residential capital.
Right.
Our record on investment is poor. We're well below where we were 5 or 6 years ago, partly because most of our investment nationally came in the energy sector, and that has really, really dropped off a cliff over the last 5 or 6 years. So that's one major contributing factor. But at the same time, I mean, just saying that businesses need to invest more is not a solution.
Right.
We also need to do more R&D, more innovation, more commercialization. And those are answers that everybody knows. But saying it and doing it are two very different things. I mean, if this was an easy problem to solve, we would have done it by now. Well,
we will tackle that problem on another episode of the podcast, because we are very quickly running out of time. So just a couple final questions for you, Mike. The first, what is your level of optimism, and what is your outlook on Alberta over the next quarter?
I think that we're going to see a slight moderation in growth and potentially employment growth, but it's still, things are going pretty well. Mm-hmm. So we're going to see just maybe a modest slowdown, but with all the new investment that's coming in, a lot of optimism, a lot of new people coming in, there's a lot of tailwinds as well. So the entire world is facing geopolitical uncertainty and inflation pressures. And in Alberta, we're better positioned than most to withstand those things.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much, Mike. Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And finally, don't forget to subscribe, rate the show, and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.